Prior to 2015, most of the construction industry voluntarily followed OSHA's general industry standard on permit-required confined spaces. But in 2015, OSHA enacted a new confined space standard just for construction.
Fortunately, the new construction standard is similar to the general industry standard, so we'll bring you up to speed on your responsibilities as a mechanical construction worker.
We'll cover confined space classifications, potential confined space hazards, the methods used to isolate or control the hazards or otherwise protect entrants, your duties when you're an authorized entrant, and your duties when you're working as an attendant. So what's the typical confined space that you may find on a construction site? To be considered a confined space, the space has to meet 3 criteria. First, it has to be large enough and shaped in a way to allow a worker to get his full body inside of it. Second, the access into and out of the space has to be limited or in some way restricted. Third, the space is not designed for continuous human occupancy. Some examples of confined spaces that we frequently encounter in mechanical construction include steam pits, water meter pits, backwater valve pits, excavations, sewers, utility vaults, process vessels, ducts, tunnels, and shafts. Confined spaces have 2 different classifications: permit required and non-permit required. Permit-required confined spaces have a hazardous atmosphere, contain physical hazards, or have other recognized safety or health hazards. They can't be entered without a special permit that confirms that the safe entry procedures from your company's permit space program have been met. A permit-required confined space can be reclassified as a non-permit required confined space when all of the hazards can be eliminated or controlled without entering the space.
There are 4 major hazards you need to be aware of when preparing to enter a confined space.
The first hazard is oxygen content. Too little oxygen and workers inside the space simply lose their ability to breathe. Too much oxygen and the space would be set up to accelerate the rate of combustion if fire occurs. And when the rate of combustion is rapid enough, it becomes an explosion. The second hazard is flammable gases or vapors. Methane and hydrogen are good examples of gases or vapors that we might encounter in the mechanical construction industry. If they're present in a confined space, it wouldn't take much of an ignition source to generate a raging fire or, under the right conditions, an explosion. The third hazard is toxic air contaminants. Examples of toxic contaminants that we might face are carbon monoxide or hydrogen sulfide. Toxic contaminants that are present in large enough concentrations can incapacitate workers inside the space and can be fatal. Fourth is physical hazards, like stored mechanical, hydraulic, or pneumatic energy. Some of the common physical hazards in mechanical construction are energized electrical conductors, excessive noise, and excessive heat.
Think for a minute about what these hazards could do to a fitter, a plumber, an HVAC technician, a sheet metal worker. You can see why confined space safety is so important. When you're an authorized entrant, your company, with your help, will isolate, control, or eliminate confined space hazards. And when that's not possible, help you protect yourself in other ways.
Before you can safely enter a confined space, it takes a thorough evaluation of the space by a competent person, safe entry procedures based on the results of that evaluation, and authorization to enter from the entry supervisor. Your company will designate a knowledgeable, experienced person to be the competent person for confined space entry at your job site. Your company also designates the entry supervisor. He is a qualified person, usually a company supervisor, who oversees the entry operation and terminates entry when operations are completed. To begin, the competent person will treat the space as if it's a permit-required space. He'll evaluate the atmosphere inside the space with a specialized instrument before any ventilation systems are established, checking the oxygen content, and testing for the presence of flammable gases and vapors and toxic air contaminants. He'll also determine whether there are any physical hazards in the space. The oxygen content inside the space needs to be between 19.5% and 23.5%.
If it's not, workers won't be allowed in the space, and it'll need to be properly ventilated and retested to ensure that the oxygen content is safe for entry.
Ventilation is also performed when flammable gases and vapors or toxic air contaminants are present in the space. There's no entry until the space has been properly ventilated and retesting shows that it's safe to enter. If physical hazards are present, they'll be eliminated or isolated with engineering controls or otherwise rendered safe before entry occurs.
When the evaluation shows that the space is free of atmospheric hazards and all hazards in the space are eliminated or isolated without entry, the space may be reclassified as a non-permit space.
But continuous monitoring in the space will be performed throughout the entry process to detect any potentially hazardous changes that may occur in the space. Monitoring equipment for confined space entry has built-in alarms. If the alarm sounds, it means that a hazardous atmospheric condition has been detected, or the monitor's battery is going dead. Either way, you need to evacuate the space immediately.
So what happens if the atmospheric hazards can't be eliminated or controlled with ventilation by itself? The ventilation will continue, but you'll also need the entry permit and the additional protection of a respirator.
The respirator you'll need will depend on the types of hazards in the space. Your company will make that determination for you and ensure that you get a medical evaluation and properly fit tested, as well as the necessary training in respirator selection, use, cleaning, maintenance, and storage.
The bottom line is, as an authorized entrant, never enter any confined space unless you've completed all of the necessary training, are authorized by your company to enter the space, and the competent person tells you that all the necessary preparations have been completed and the space is now safe for you to enter.
You'll also need an attendant just outside the space the entire time the entry operation is being performed. When you enter the space, you'll have to wear a chest or full body harness, with one end of the retrieval line attached to the harness and the other end attached to the retrieval device itself, or some other fixed point outside the space. In some cases, usually because of entry point constriction, you may have to wear wristlets or anklets instead of the harness, but your company will have to make that determination. Fully understand your training on permit space entry requirements and the specific hazards that you might face during the entry process.
Know how to properly use all the equipment you'll need for safe entry.
Testing and monitoring equipment, ventilation equipment, communications equipment, lighting equipment, personal protective equipment, barriers and shields, equipment for safe entry and exit, rescue and emergency equipment, and any other necessary equipment. When you're inside the confined space, communicate with the attendant frequently enough so that he can accurately assess your status and give you an evacuation alert if necessary. Immediately alert the attendant and evacuate the space anytime there's a warning sign, a physical symptom of exposure to danger, or if you detect a prohibited condition in the space. Also, evacuate the space immediately anytime the attendant gives an evacuation order or an evacuation alarm is activated.
Evacuating.
Since you'll be doing mechanical work inside confined spaces, there are a few very specific things that also need your attention.
Make sure that any pipes, pumps, or lines that could cause a hazard inside a space are disconnected, shut down, and locked and tagged out or otherwise effectively isolated.
Hazards outside the space can lead to hazards inside the space, such as vapors from a nearby sewer line or carbon monoxide from a nearby vehicle. Even though the entry supervisor and attendant will look for hazards outside the space, these types of hazards can appear quickly on construction sites. It's smart for you to keep an eye out for them, too.
Don't forget that hot work, like welding or cutting, especially when you're using shield gases like argon, can deplete the oxygen in a confined space. Make sure that the ventilation system is working properly and that atmospheric monitoring is performed continuously in the entrance breathing zone while performing any type of hot work inside a space. Never bring your fuel gas and oxygen tanks into the space, and remove the torch and hoses from the space immediately after you complete the hot work. Make sure the CFM rating of your ventilation fan provides adequate air changes for your space, and always minimize the number of bends in your vent fan hose.
If flammable gases or vapors could be present, make sure the radios, lights, monitoring equipment, and all other electrical equipment that will be used in the space are intrinsically safe.
In these types of situations, all electrical equipment has to be rated Class 1 Division 1 so that it won't become an ignition source. Be careful about other potential ignition sources as well. Use non-sparking tools, and obviously, hot work is out of the question in these conditions.
At some point, you may be asked to serve as an attendant, but even if you never do, it's still important to understand the duties of an attendant.
Just like authorized entrants, attendants have to fully understand the hazards that could be faced both inside and outside the space during entry procedures. But attendants also have to understand the behavior effects of hazard exposure on the entrance, so they can determine when an entrant needs assistance. Any unusual behavior, such as dizziness, sleepiness, headache, nausea, or incoherent speech, should trigger an immediate evacuation of all entrants. It's important for attendants to keep an accurate account of all entrants inside the space, so that each of them can be properly assessed throughout the duration of entry. If you're an attendant, you'll have to remain right outside the space's entrance during all entry operations unless another qualified attendant relieves you. While you're on duty, you won't be allowed to do anything else that could distract you from your duties. You'll need to stay focused on assessing and protecting the entrance. Communicate verbally or electronically with each of the entrants at least every couple of minutes so that you can assess their status and order them to evacuate if necessary.
While entry operations are ongoing, assess activities both inside and outside the space so you know whether it's safe for entrants to remain inside. Evacuate the space immediately anytime you become aware of a prohibited condition, it becomes apparent that an entrant is experiencing behavior effects, anything occurs outside the space that could endanger the entrance, for some reason you can no longer effectively and safely perform your job, or you lose communication with the entrance. As the attendant, you will have to be prepared to perform non-entry rescues if necessary. Your company will ensure that you have the proper hands-on training for the rescue equipment. Just be sure the equipment you'll need for rescue is easily accessible in case you need it.
You also have to immediately call rescue or other emergency services if you determine that an entrant needs assistance.
I've got a man down in our confined space.
Your company will carefully evaluate, select, and place on standby rescue and emergency services that can respond in a timely manner and effectively perform rescue and emergency services for confined space entry operations.
In the unlikely event that an entry confined space rescue is needed, these services are there for you. Unless you're authorized, properly trained, and practiced at confined space entry rescues, don't be tempted to enter a confined space to make a rescue if non-entry rescue procedures failed. Way too many attendants have lost their lives that way.
The best thing you can do is be prepared to call the established rescue and emergency services immediately and wait for their arrival. And one other thing. If you experience an unauthorized person approaching the space, warn the person to stay away from it, or if they're already inside the space, order them to leave it immediately. Then warn the entrants that there's an unauthorized person in the space, and be sure to report it to the entry supervisor as soon as you can. The entry supervisor is responsible for removing unauthorized individuals from the area. The entry supervisor may not be right at the space the whole time that entry operations are taking place, but he must be available when needed. As fitters, plumbers, HVAC technicians, and sheet metal workers, the type of work we do requires more confined space work than most other trades.
But the good news is it's not all that hard to perform the entry safely. When you have to work in a confined space, make sure that you
know the classification of the space you'll be entering, are familiar with and understand the hazards in the space, have authorization to enter from the entry supervisor, properly implement all of the methods that are being used by your company to isolate, control, or eliminate the hazards or otherwise protect you from confined space hazards, and carefully implement your duties as an authorized entrant or attendant.
If you work in this business long enough, you'll do a lot of work in confined spaces. To do that work safely, just follow these safe work practices and make sure everyone else working around you does too.